Hey everyone, welcome to Barter Hordes. My name is Robert, and today I want to talk to you about the last two World War II books that I've read. Recently I read a historical novel followed by a memoir, both in and around World War II. The novel is Codename Hélène by Ariel Lawhon. Just came out this year, and it's kind of a story that if you just read the story without knowing anything about the actual history behind it, it almost seems too unbelievable. It just seems like there's just no way this could have happened the way it did. But then when you read the author's note at the end, and she outlines for you all the actual documents and things that really happened, this story is based on a real life person and set of events. It just makes it even more fantastic. It's completely enjoyable to read. It's a dual timeline narrative. It centers on an Australian woman named Nancy Wake, who was a socialite. She was living in Paris, working as a freelance journalist for the Hearst paper group in Paris. In fact, her very first interview, which is mentioned in the book, and this is actually true, her very first interview for the Hearst paper group was interviewing Hitler back in the 30s. And so right from the beginning, she has a very fantastical backstory. She meets a man in Paris, Marseille's most eligible bachelor, Henri Fioca, and they have a long courtship and ultimately do marry. And when the war is starting to put pressure on France after Poland is invaded and France starts to be overrun by the Germans, they have moved from Paris to Marseille, and then her husband, Henri, is actually called up to serve in the French army, defending the Maginot Line, of all things, which didn't defend very well. And while he's gone, she starts helping some local people with resistance efforts, delivering forged identity cards and things like that. And she gets fairly involved and actually finances some of these things herself because they are well off. And when her husband comes back, he is slightly wounded, not terribly wounded, he's slightly wounded. He realizes she's not going to discontinue her efforts. And so he stands behind her as she continues to work for the resistance, even while still in France. But then the Vichy government is starting to catch on to who she is and is closing in on her, and he forces her to flee to go to London. And she does. She ends up going across the Pyrenees into Spain and then eventually ending up in London. And she's supposed to wait for him there. What she doesn't know is that he's captured and imprisoned. While she's in London, she is recruited by the SOE, the Special Operations Executive, I think is what the acronym stands for, which is kind of like a spy agency to collect information, to arrange for arms shipments. Basically, she's recruited to go to France to help organize the French resistance in the Auvergne prior to the Normandy invasion. So this has a dual timeline. The 1930s, 1938, 39, when she first is working in Paris and meets Henri. And then the second timeline is the last year of the war in Europe, where she is in Paris, or not in Paris, but in France. And it's just a wonderfully told, wonderfully frightening book. At every turn, you know something disastrous could happen, and sometimes does. And so I was just thoroughly entranced by this one. I actually did this one both text and audio together, and the woman who reads the audio, I forget now who does it, does a terrific job. And so I really enjoyed that joint text and audio experience. The second World War II book I read right after that is a memoir. This was a memoir that was originally written in 1945 and published on a very small scale and virtually forgotten about. And then someone discovered it in an attic in 2010, and it's been re-released. And it's written by Françoise Frenkel, and the title of the English edition is A Bookshop in Berlin, which I have a problem with, but it's not her fault. That's not what she called it. She called it No Place to Lay My Head, if you translate her French title. Frenkel was a Polish Jew who had studied before World War One in Paris. She studied at the Sorbonne. She studied literature. And so she was already in love with France. And then she moved back to France after World War One was over. And she decided that the thing that she wanted to do more than anything in the world was to be a bookseller, to run a French bookshop. But of course, the French cities that she went to didn't need one. She went back to her hometown in Poland and a couple neighboring cities. They all had adequate French bookstore resources, so she didn't know what to do. She happened to be in Berlin and noticed that there was absolutely no way to get French books in Berlin. And so she fought against all the advice and the warnings that this is a bad idea and opens her bookshop in Berlin. And it becomes successful over time, and she has it for a number of years until Hitler comes to power and World War II starts to create pressures on her, both as a foreigner in Germany and as a Jew. So she ends up leaving her bookstore in Berlin. She goes back to France, and then over the course of the next several years, as the Vichy government, which was basically the puppet of Hitler, began putting pressure on foreigners in France because she's Polish, and especially Jews in France. She ends up having to go into hiding a couple of different times, moving around a couple different cities until she ultimately can make her escape into Switzerland. She has to try 3 times before she can actually make a successful crossing into Switzerland. And on the surface, it's a really interesting sounding story. The publisher has marketed it as one of the most harrowing escapes of all time. And it's just not, unfortunately. And I don't mean to diminish what she actually suffered through. She went through a lot, from the loss of her bookstore, the loss of a lot of her possessions, all sorts of things. But it's not the kind of harrowing escape you expect from the marketing hype surrounding this book. She was never in any real physical jeopardy. She almost got arrested and deported a couple of times in some of the roundups of Jews. So that was kind of harrowing, if you will. But she never did get caught until she tries to cross into Switzerland. And even there, when she's arrested trying to cross into Switzerland, she has a Swiss visa to travel within Switzerland if she can get there. And she's well connected and well financed, and she hires a very good lawyer. And she is acquitted by a French court and released. And then a couple of months later, she crosses over into Switzerland. So she's never actually in the kind of peril that would live up to the kind of hype in this marketing campaign for this book. So that's my first problem with it. My second problem with it is she completely writes her husband out of the story. In fact, you don't know she has a husband until you read the end documentation. But she had a husband who was a partner of hers in the bookstore in Berlin. He was actually a Russian immigrant. And he was arrested and sent to die in Auschwitz. And she never once mentions in her entire memoir ever having had a husband. And there's no explanation for why. I don't know. I would have to speculate. Maybe his story was more harrowing than hers, so she just wrote it out of the book. We'll never know. I don't know. But that bothers me a little bit, that she just leaves out kind of a major detail. Because the third thing that bothers me about this book is her writing style. She doesn't leave out any details. She describes every blade of grass, every flower she sees, every conversation she has, every pastry she eats. And it's all done in this breathless, overblown, melodramatic style. And I did this one also with the audiobook, and I do not recommend the audiobook on this one. I don't know who reads it. It's a British voice. But she even makes the overblown style sound even more overblown. And so it was just annoying by the end of it, because she's describing things that aren't particularly important as if they were the turning point of the war. And so I really lost patience with the tone of this memoir, even though the story itself is worth telling. It's just not worth hyping like it's been hyped. And so I can understand why it probably didn't get the notice after it was originally published that other books have gotten, because they were much more adventurous and harrowing and, you know, keep you on the edge of your seat. It's not a mystery novel. I realize that. It's her actual story, but the way she tells it tries to make it sound like something more than it really was. And I feel for the people whose stories aren't told in that situation. So that one was a disappointment to me in the long run. The novel, codename Hélène, I loved. The memoir, A Bookshop in Berlin, it's not really about a bookshop. That disappears after about the first couple of chapters. And so that one really didn't work too well for me. So if you're interested in World War II literature, and if you followed my channel for any time at all, you know that I love World War II literature. And I don't really know why. I mean, it's probably the defining historical event of the 20th century. And for some reason, even though it happened before I was born, by a few years, not too many, but by a few, the human stories surrounding World War II literature are what capture me. I'm not all that interested in the military strategy and the politics and things like that. It's the human stories that draw me into World War II literature. And I think that's why I loved Codename Hélène so much. So if you're interested in World War II stories at all, I definitely recommend Codename Hélène. I'd say take a pass on A Bookshop in Berlin. Hope you're having a great week as we wrap up 2020, thank God, and move into 2021. I'll be back with you on New Year's Day with my video for my favorite reads from 2020. Talk to you then, everybody. Bye-bye.